President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion
surrender to communism in Asia without simultaneously undermining our efforts.
Italian commies riot in effort to block the Atlantic Pact.
That you're spending so much time with people who are nothing but communists.
11 Communist Party leaders on charges of conspiring against the state. 400 police.
In the late 1940s, America was on edge. The rise of the communist Soviet Union had American leaders and citizens alike worried about what was known as the Red Menace, communism. By 1950, the Soviets had already tested a nuclear bomb. Communist forces had taken over China, and the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia had taken control of the Czech government. These events had created an apprehensive and confused America, but one politician managed to exacerbate those tensions. During the Second Red Scare, Joseph McCarthy exploited the fear in everyday Americans through scare tactics and misinformation. Communication was responsible for both his rise and fall, ultimately becoming the reason he lost credibility. Even so, he was still able to leave his mark on America, changing the social norms of the time, as well as paving the way for future politicians to copy his methods. Joseph McCarthy was elected to the Wisconsin Senate in 1946. He was a relatively minor figure in politics for the first 4 years of his career, but everything changed on February 9, 1950. It was on that day that McCarthy gave a speech titled "Enemies from Within" at the Republican Women's Club in Wheeling, West Virginia. He claimed to have inside knowledge of the inner workings of communist spies in the government, announcing, "I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department." Following the momentous speech, McCarthy experienced a meteoric rise to power. He was re-elected in 1952 and was appointed chairman of the Senate's Committee on Government Operations. Throughout it all, he continued to accuse ordinary citizens and government workers alike, pointing fingers at anyone he suspected of communism. It's unclear whether McCarthy truly believed the accusations he was making, but in the weeks following his groundbreaking speech, he revised the number of known communists in the State Department multiple times. McCarthy initially claimed it was 205, then reduced the number to 81, before finally settling on 57. This fluctuation of the statistic sheds doubt on the credibility of the evidence. Despite the inconsistencies in McCarthy's claims, the American public believed him wholeheartedly and started to panic. People began to suspect their neighbors and friends of communism and became distant and closed off. No one knew exactly what was happening, but most Americans looked to McCarthy as the solution, rather than the problem.
I certainly am more than happy to be out here tonight, away from Washington for at least one day and back in the United States.
A politician that appeared to be telling Americans the unveiled truth was universally appealing, and because of it, Americans believed McCarthy's outlandish claims. By the end of 1953, McCarthy's approval ratings in the United States were over 50%. But while average Americans hailed McCarthy as a hero, the government was less enthusiastic. Harry Truman, who was president in the 2 years that followed McCarthy's historic speech, found McCarthy's brash methods and overconfidence to be a disgrace to American politics. The telegram shown here was from Truman to McCarthy just after the speech in Wheeling. Truman was fed up with McCarthy's blatant lies, but McCarthy wasn't bothered by Truman's condemnation, at least not enough to change his ways. When President Eisenhower was inaugurated in 1953, he was privately just as disgusted with McCarthy as Truman, but refused to cross him when McCarthy had so much popular support. What set McCarthy apart from other politicians were the bullying tactics he used to push his colleagues and those he was investigating around. He communicated through unabashed lying, twisting the facts for his own personal gain. The term McCarthyism, which is known as the practice of making accusations of subversion or treason, especially when related to communism, without any proper regard for evidence, was coined because of him. Yet as dishonest as McCarthy's methods were, they were effective. Over 2,000 government employees lost their jobs because of his investigations, whether they were really communists or not. McCarthy's relentless investigations took off in full flood in 1953 and continued for over a year. April 1954 marked perhaps the most significant of his investigations, a 2-month-long period of televised congressional hearings known as the Army McCarthy hearings. McCarthy was attempting to investigate Army security, and the Army in turn accused McCarthy of using his influence to win preferential treatment for a former staff member. It was at these hearings that McCarthy finally fell from grace. For the first time, the American people were able to see McCarthy's brash and aggressive nature and the way that he conducted himself in his work. Most Americans were disgusted with the way he attempted to intimidate those around him and spewed lies as easily as facts. Furthermore, he had gone a step too far by accusing the military. Indicting faceless government figures was one thing, but it was quite another to accuse an institution many Americans had a personal connection with. The hearings culminated on June 9, 1954, when McCarthy claimed that one of the Army's lawyers, Joseph Welch, had an attorney in his employ that had ties to a communist organization. Americans and politicians alike were amazed when Welch delivered the sharp rebuke that proved to be the end of McCarthy's career.
Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir?
Almost overnight, McCarthy's popular support vanished. The hearings, and Welch's words, had revealed who he really was. McCarthy was censured on December 2nd, 1954, and died 3 years later. Though McCarthy himself was gone by 1958, the impacts of his anti-communist crusade long outlasted him. Fearful Americans on the lookout for communists believed that any neighbor who didn't regularly attend Christian church was a possible communist. Americans were also told, even by McCarthy himself, that people who were homosexual and in the State Department made the country vulnerable to communism.
The pervert is easy prey to the blackmailer.
This, along with McCarthy's accusations that 2 of his known communists were gay men, contributed to the panic over the idea of LGBTQ+ workers in the government.
Homosexuals must not be handling top-secret material.
It led to mass investigations and dismissal of homosexual employees and communicated to the American public that homosexuality was wrong. The methods of Joseph McCarthy, miscommunication, lying, and scare tactics, might sound familiar to Americans who have lived through the presidency of Donald Trump. And in fact, lawyer Roy Cohn is a direct link between McCarthy and Trump. Roy Cohn was McCarthy's aide, and the two worked together on many high-profile investigations, stirring up the American public through exaggerations and outright lies. Decades after McCarthy's fall, Cohn befriended a young Donald Trump and became his lawyer and advisor in multiple legal proceedings. When asked about the relationship between Trump and Cohn, Cohn's domestic partner, Peter Fraser, said that Trump was certainly his apprentice. The legacy of McCarthy's methods took on a new life with Donald Trump. Communication drove the rise and fall of McCarthy's career. Misinformation and bullying tactics propelled McCarthy into the national spotlight, but it was those 6 famous words, "Have you no sense of decency?" that caused his career and reputation to plummet. Whether it was through short-term shifts in societal norms or longer-term impacts, McCarthy changed the course of American history forever. Joseph McCarthy was his own undoing, but with more time in politics, he may have been America's.